I want to spend a few minutes today talking to you about capitalization. It's not something that we focus on a lot in English 1301, but there are 13 rules that I think students need to become a little bit more familiar with when they're writing their essay. The first rule is to make sure that you capitalize the first word in a sentence. This is probably the very first writing rule that you learned, but for whatever reason, it is becoming more popular for students now to not necessarily always capitalize that first letter. Make sure you're doing it. It's a rule you cannot break. The second rule that started to come into essays in the recent past is students are not capitalizing the pronoun I. Anytime you see the letter I and it's being used as a pronoun in your paper, that word needs to be capitalized. There's no exception to this rule. So make sure you're capitalizing the pronoun I. Make sure you're capitalizing people's names. And the way that I see this rule broke most often is when you're dealing with a business. Students will begin by capitalizing the first name in the business, but sometimes they won't continue that on through all of the names of the business. So make sure that when you're talking about a company like Best Buy, that you're capitalizing both B's. If you're talking about a restaurant like the Olive Garden, make sure you've got a capital O and a capital G. Make sure you've got the whole name capitalized. Sometimes an adjective helps define something, and the ones that you want to be careful of are adjectives that deal with ethnicity, Spanish, French, any of those kind of words. Make sure you get that adjective capitalized. It's dealing with an ethnicity. Those things always get capitalized. High school, middle school, elementary school, those words are always a little bit tricky for some students. You see the wrong sentence there at the bottom of your screen. I went to high school. If we're just talking about high school, we're not going to capitalize the H. We're not going to capitalize the S. The only time that you would capitalize high school, middle school, elementary school are when you're using the full name of the school, as you see in that very last sentence there on your screen. Everything's capitalized because that is the full name of that school. Also, make sure you're capitalizing adjectives when they're part of a full name of a place. You see there your example. Brown's an adjective. Sometimes students don't capitalize that because why would I capitalize the word brown? It's a color. But in this particular case, this adjective is part of the full name of a place. So let's make sure that we get that adjective capitalized as well. Make sure you're titling the essays that you turn in to your teachers, and then make sure you're following proper capitalization rules when it comes to the title of your essay. Also, if your essay talks about a movie that you watched or a book that you read, make sure you're properly capitalizing those things as well. The eighth rule that we want to talk about real quick is what to do with a person's title. If the title comes after a person's name, we are not going to capitalize the title. So the first example you see there is wrong because President of the United States comes after his name. The second example is the correct way to do that because the title comes before the name. So when the title comes before, capitalize it. When the title comes after, leave it in lowercase letters. A tricky situation for students is when we talk about mom, dad, aunt, uncle, things of that nature. And an easy rule of thumb here is take out the word mom or dad and put in the person's name. If the sentence makes sense, we're going to capitalize mom and dad. If the sentence does not make sense, we're going to leave mom and dad in lowercase letters. So you can see there in that first example, we should not be capitalizing mom because if I say my Donna was the best cook, that sentence just sounds a little funny. I can't substitute her name for mom, so I'm going to leave mom in lowercase letters. But as you see in this second example here, the word Tim can replace the word dad, and it makes sense. So this time, because the name works as the title, this time I'm going to leave dad capitalized because I can make that switch, and it does still make sense. Make sure you're capitalizing geographic locations. So when you're referring to a specific part of the country and that's a direction, make sure you get it up. However, if you're using cardinal directions or compass directions in your essay, those things are generally not capitalized. This rule you won't encounter a lot in your 1301 class. You may want to file it away for when you get into 1302 and you start using quotations. But if you're going to use a quotation in your essay, make sure you're capitalizing the first word in that quotation, even if it starts in the middle of your sentence. Another big spelling or capitalization mistake that we see with students is they like to capitalize the names of classes that they took in high school. The rule that you want to follow here is if it's a generic word like math or science or history, we aren't going to capitalize those things. But if it's a very specific name like algebra, calculus, trigonometry, those are the words that we are going to capitalize there as well. And then the last rule that we want to talk about is, should you use a colon or a semicolon in your essay, you're not going to capitalize the word that comes after the semicolon or the word that comes after the semicolon. The exception to that would be is if you need to capitalize that word for any of the first 12 reasons that we've talked about in this video. But if you can't apply one of those 12 reasons to that word, you're going to leave that word in lowercase form. If you have any questions about capitalization, feel free to send me an email at the email address you see there on the screen, or come by my office during the hours that are listed on your syllabus. If I'm not available to you, definitely stop by L200 and talk to one of our awesome tutors down there in the Writing Center. And then if you're a distance learner who just does not come up to campus, feel free to take a look at Purdue's grammar website that they have on their webpage, and you can see the address there on your screen.